Man removes bear trap in woods months later. Bear does the unbelievable to save two children. Tom Wheeler had lived in the Montana wilderness for over 40 years. And in all that time he'd never heard anything quite like the sound that echoed through the dawn mist that autumn morning. It was a mix between a moan and a cry, something that made his weathered heart squeeze with sympathy despite not knowing its source. At 72, most folks would have called the Rangers or stayed safely in their cabin, but Tom hadn't. Survived 4 decades in these mountains by ignoring his instincts, grabbing his old field kit and flashlight. The sun hadn't quite broken through the pines yet. He set out to investigate. The crying grew louder as he approached Miller's Creek, a spot where he'd often seen wildlife come to drink. Through the thinning mist he spotted her, a full-grown female black bear. Her powerful body twisted awkwardly as she struggled against an illegal trap that had clamped around her front paw. "Oh Lord above," Tom whispered, his heart breaking at the sight. The trap was the cruel kind that had been banned years ago, likely set by poachers who still plagued these parts. The bear's eyes, wild with pain and fear, fixed on him. Most people would have seen a dangerous predator, but Tom saw something different in those deep brown eyes. He recognized something universal, a living creature in pain asking for help in the only way it could ease their mama. He spoke softly, using the same gentle tone he'd used years ago when helping his wife Sarah through her final days. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bear's cries softened as if somehow understanding. Tom knew he was probably crazy for what he was about to do, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes the craziest actions were the most human. Moving slowly, he set down his kit and opened it, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The bear watched him, still whimpering but no longer thrashing, whether from exhaustion or understanding. Tom couldn't tell. "This is going to hurt a bit, Mama," he warned, approaching with his tools. "But we'll get you free." What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone else as Tom worked to disable the trap's mechanism. The bear remained still, only occasionally letting out a soft moan. When the jaws of the trap finally released, she quickly pulled her injured paw free, but didn't run away immediately. Instead, she turned those intelligent eyes toward Tom, who had already stepped back to give her space. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other, an old man and a wild bear connected by an act of compassion. Then she did something that made Tom question everything he thought he knew about wild animals. She limped forward, her injured paw held close to her chest, and gently nudged his hand with her nose before disappearing into the forest. Tom stood there, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, understanding that he just experienced something profound, but he had no idea that this encounter was just the beginning of an extraordinary relationship that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone in the small mountain community. As he gathered his tools, he noticed something in the mud where the bear had been trapped, tracks from smaller paws, cubs somewhere in these woods. That mama bear had babies waiting for her. Tom smiled, knowing he'd done more than just save one animal. He'd helped keep a family together. What he didn't know yet was that the mama bear wouldn't forget his kindness, and that this morning's rescue would lead to a series of events that would make even the most hardened skeptics believe in the deep connections possible between humans and wild creatures. 3 days later, Tom was sitting on his front porch sipping his morning coffee and watching the sun paint the mountains gold when he heard rustling in the undergrowth near his cabin. His eyes widened as the same bear emerged from the trees, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, tumbling and stumbling in the way only young creatures can, came 2 small cubs. The mama bear's injured paw was healing. She still favored it slightly, but the swelling had gone down. She sat at the edge of his yard about 30 feet from the porch and gave him that same intelligent look he'd seen in the woods. "Well, I'll be," Tom whispered, setting his coffee cup down slowly. "You came to show me your babies, didn't you?" As if in response, the bear made a soft chuffing sound, and the cubs, previously wrestling in the grass, looked up with curious eyes. Tom noticed she'd brought something in her mouth, a fresh-caught fish, which she deliberately placed on the ground before backing away a few steps. "A thank you gift," Tom chuckled softly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah would never believe this. For the next hour, Tom sat perfectly still, watching as the bear family went about their morning. The cubs played, the mother kept a watchful eye, and occasionally all 3 would look at him as if making sure he was still there. It was like being invited into a private family moment in the wild. This visit marked the beginning of what the locals would later call the Bee Ladies' friendship. Every few days the Bee family would return. Sometimes they'd bring gifts, fish berries, or once amusingly a slightly battered park ranger's hat that made Tom wonder what story lay behind that particular fine word began to spread through the small mountain community. At first people thought old Tom Wheeler had finally lost his mind, spinning tales about a grateful bear, but then Margaret Chin, who ran the general store, saw it herself while making a delivery to Tom's cabin. "I couldn't believe my eyes," she told anyone who would listen. "Those bears were sitting in his yard like they were family coming for Sunday dinner, and Tom, he was just talking to them like they could understand every word." As autumn progressed, something remarkable began happening in the community. The reports of poaching decreased dramatically. It seemed the mama bear had spread the word. Somehow the animals became more cautious around certain areas where traps had often been found, but the most extraordinary moment came during the first snow of the season. Tom had been feeling under the weather, his old joints aching with the cold. He hadn't been able to make his usual trip to Margaret's store for supplies. That evening he heard familiar scratching at his door. There stood the mama bear, and at her feet was a collection of wild berries and fresh pine branches, the kind he often used to make tea for his arthritis. Her cubs stood behind her, each clutching small bundles of berries in their mouths. "You knew I was sick, didn't you?" Tom asked, tears freezing on his cheeks in the cold air. The bear made her familiar chuffing sound, nudging the offerings closer to his door that night. As Tom sipped his pine needle tea and watched the bear family make their way back into the darkening forest, he thought about Sarah. She'd always told him that kindness was like a pebble thrown into a pond. The ripples would spread far beyond the initial splash. "You were right, old girl," he said to her picture on the mantel. "You were right about so many things." The story of Tom and his bear family would have remained just a local legend shared over coffee at Margaret's store if it hadn't been for what happened next, an event that would not only prove the depth of this unusual friendship but would also save lives in a way nobody could have predicted. As the winter settled in and the snow deepened in the mountains, none of the locals knew that nature was about to test this extraordinary bond between man and beast in a way that would make headlines across the country. December brought one of the worst blizzards in Montana's history. The temperature plummeted to 30 below and the snow piled up 6 feet deep in some places. Tom had prepared for winter, as he always did, but even he was concerned about the intensity of this storm. One particularly brutal night, as the wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves, Tom heard frantic scratching at his door. Opening it, he found Mama Bear in obvious distress. Her sea weren't with her, and she was making urgent sounds he'd never heard before. "What is it, girl? Where are your babies?" Tom asked, already reaching for his coat and boots. The bear turned and looked back into the swirling snow, then at Tom again, pawing at his leg. Despite every survival instinct telling him to stay inside during such dangerous weather, Tom understood. "You want me to follow you?" he said, quickly gathering his emergency pack and flashlight. "Lead the way, Mama." The bear moved surprisingly fast through the deep snow, occasionally looking back to make sure Tom was following. They traveled about a mile into the woods to an area near a steep ravine. There, trapped in a narrow crevice and nearly buried in snow, were her cubs. But Tom's heart nearly stopped when he saw something else, a small human hand sticking out of the snow near the cubs. The bear's cubs weren't alone in that crevice. "Dear God," Tom whispered, dropping to his knees and starting to dig. Within moments he uncovered 2 children, a boy and a girl no more than 8 or 9 years old, huddled together with the bear cubs. The kids were unconscious but still breathing, their body heat preserved by their closeness to the cubs. Tom recognized them as the Anderson children from a cabin about 3 miles away. They must have gotten lost in the storm. The mama bear had found them, and instead of seeing them as threat to her cubs, had tried to protect them, even seeking human help when she couldn't get them out herself. "You're one amazing mama," Tom said, his voice breaking as he worked to free the children. The bear helped, using her powerful paws to clear snow while being incredibly gentle near the kids. Getting 4 small bodies out of that crevice was no easy task for an old man, but Tom managed it. With the bear's help, he wrapped the children in his emergency blankets, tucking a cub under each child's arm for warmth. "We never make it to their cabin in this storm," Tom told the bear. "They'll have to come to mine." What happened next became the stuff of local legend. The mama bear carried one of her cubs while Tom carried the children, one over each shoulder. The remaining cub, the smaller one, rode tucked inside Tom's coat. Together, man and bear fought their way through the blizzard, the bear actually breaking trail through the deepest snow. When they finally reached Tom's cabin, he quickly got the children near the fire and began the careful process of warming them up. The bear and her cubs stayed inside too. An unprecedented situation that Tom knew Sarah would have found both terrifying and hilarious throughout the night. As The children slowly regained consciousness. The mama bear helped Tom by lying next to them, sharing her warmth. Her cubs, now fully recovered from their ordeal, cuddled with the children as if they were all siblings. When little Emily Anderson finally opened her eyes, she showed no fear of the bears. Instead, she reached out and touched the mama bear's nose. "You saved us," she whispered. "The angel bear saved us." "That she did," Tom agreed, wiping tears from his eyes. "That she did." As dawn broke and the storm began to ease, Tom knew this night would change everything, not just for him but for everyone who would hear the story. It would challenge everything people thought they knew about wild animals, about compassion, about the boundaries between species. But the night's events weren't over yet. As the morning light grew stronger, Tom could hear the distant sound of helicopters. The search for the missing Anderson children was about to collide with the miracle that had unfolded in his cabin. The helicopters' worrying grew louder, and Tom could see the panic rising in the mama bear's eyes. He knelt beside her, speaking softly, "Trust me one more time, girl. No one's going to hurt you or your babies." The Anderson children were now fully awake, sipping hot cocoa and still snuggled against the bear cubs. Emily hadn't let go of the smaller cub's paw since she'd awakened, and her brother Jake kept patting the mama bear's shoulder as if to make sure she was real. When the rescue team burst through the door, led by the children's father John Anderson and 2 forest rangers, they froze at the sight before them. There in Tom Wheeler's cabin sat 2 missing children, having breakfast with a family of black bears as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Nobody move," one of the rangers whispered, reaching for his tranquilizer gun. "You put that away, son," Tom said firmly, standing between the bears and the newcomers. "This mama bear is the reason these children are alive. She's earned the right to leave here with dignity when she's ready." John Anderson, tears freezing on his face, looked from his children to the bear and back again. "Emily, Jake, are you really okay, Daddy?" Emily called out, but didn't move from her spot. "The angel bear saved us. She found us in the snow and kept us warm, and then she got Mr. Tom to help." The ranger slowly lowered his gun as Jake added, "Her cubs stayed with us all night, Dad. They're our friends now." What happened next would be talked about in Montana for generations. The mama bear stood up slowly, gently nudged each child with her nose as if saying goodbye, and gathered her cubs. The room fell silent as she walked to the door, passing within inches of the stunned rescue team. She paused only once, turning to look at Tom with those intelligent eyes. "One more time, go on, girl," Tom said softly. "You've done more than enough." After the bears disappeared into the snowy morning, the cat cabin erupted in activity. The children were checked by medics, found to be perfectly healthy despite their ordeal. Reporters began arriving, drawn by the incredible story of a bear leading a man to rescue lost children. But it was Margaret Chen's article in the local paper that captured the true essence of what had happened. She wrote not just about the rescue but about the months leading up to it, the friendship between an old man and a bear, the daily visits, the gifts, the trust built through one simple act of kindness in removing a trap. "Perhaps," she wrote, "we humans aren't as separate from the natural world as we think. Perhaps kindness speaks a language all creatures understand." The story spread far beyond their small mountain community, touching hearts across the country. Wildlife organizations began studying the incident, amazed by the bear's apparent ability to seek human help and her conscious choice to protect rather than harm the children. But for Tom, sitting on his porch a week later, it was simpler than all that. When he spotted the now familiar shapes emerging from the woods, mama bear and her cubs right on schedule for their morning visit, he just smiled. "Sarah always said kindness has a way of coming back to you," he told the bear as she settled into her usual spot in his yard. "But I don't think even she could have imagined this." The mama bear made her familiar chuffing sound, and her cubs tumbled forward to leave a handful of winter berries at the foot of his porch steps. Tom noticed her injured paw had healed completely now, leaving barely a scar, much like the bridge that had been built between two species, starting with one simple act of compassion. Spring came early that year, bringing with it unexpected changes to the mountain community. Tom's cabin became something of a pilgrimage site, with people hoping to catch a glimpse of the angel bear as she'd come to be known. But what touched Tom's heart most were the changes he saw in his neighbors. The Anderson children visited regularly, always bringing treats for the bears that their parents now helped Tom prepare, proper foods that were safe for wild animals. Emily and Jake had become passionate about wildlife preservation, starting a club at their school called Friends of the Forest. More importantly, Not a single illegal trap had been found in the area since the rescue story made headlines. The poachers had moved on. Perhaps touched by the tale, perhaps afraid of the public attention. Either way, the woods were safer now. One warm April morning, as Tom sat in his rocking chair watching Mama Bear and her growing cubs in the yard, Margaret Chun arrived with news that brought tears to his eyes. The state legislature just passed it, Tom, she announced, waving a paper. They're calling it the Angel Bear Wildlife Protection Act. It increases penalties for poaching and establishes a new wildlife sanctuary right here in these mountains. The Mama Bear looked up at Margaret's excited voice, her cubs now almost as tall as Tom's porch railing. They'd grown so much since that winter night, just as the story of their bravery had grown and touched so many lives. You hear that, girl? Tom called to the bear. You've changed more than just a few lives now, you've changed the whole mountain. As if understanding, the Mama Bear stood up and did something she'd never done before. She walked right up to Tom's porch, her cubs following, and sat down beside his rocking chair. Margaret gasped, but Tom just smiled and kept rocking the Emily and Jake still. Ask about you, he told the bear softly. They're doing good work teaching other kids about respecting wildlife. Your story helped them understand something important about kindness. The bear's response was to gently place her paw on Tom's knee just for a moment before gathering her cubs and heading back into the fir forest. It would be their last visit of the season. Tom knew she needed to lead her growing cubs deeper into the wilderness, teaching them to be the wild creatures they were meant to be. But he also knew she'd be back just as the seasons changed and the mountains endured. Some bonds couldn't be broken by time or distance. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Tom added a final entry to the journal he'd been keeping since that first encounter with the trapped bear. Sarah always told me that angels come in many forms and that kindness is the language of the soul. Looking back on this year, I understand what she meant. Sometimes it takes a bear to teach us how to be human, and sometimes it takes getting lost to help us find our way. The Mama Bear didn't just save 2 children that winter night, she reminded us all that compassion knows no boundaries and love speaks in languages we're only beginning to understand. He closed the journal and looked out at the darkening forest, knowing that somewhere out there a family of bears carried a piece of his heart with them, and that was exactly as it should be. As summer bloomed in the mountains, Tom's story attracted an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a renowned wildlife behaviorist from the University of Montana, arrived one morning just as Tom was having his coffee. Mr. Wheeler, she said, extending her hand. I've been studying human-wildlife interactions for 20 years, but I've never encountered anything quite like your story. Tom invited her to sit on the porch, pouring her a cup of coffee in Sarah's old blue mug. Most folks don't believe it at first, he admitted, until they see it for themselves. As if on cue, there was movement in the tree line. Dr. Blackwood reached for her camera, but Tom gently lowered it. Just watch, he said softly. The Mama Bear emerged, her cubs now gangly teenagers looking more like their mother every day. What happened next made even the experienced scientist gasp. The bee family moved with comfortable familiarity through Tom's yard, the cubs playing with an old tire Tom had hung from a tree for them while their mother inspected Tom's newly planted vegetable garden. They're so at ease, Dr. Blackwood whispered. This goes against everything we understand about wild bear behavior. Tom smiled, watching as Mama Bear carefully avoided stepping on his tomato plants. Maybe we don't understand as much as we think we do, he suggested. Sarah, my late wife, used to say that love and trust can bridge any gap. Over the next few hours, Dr. Blackwood witnessed something that would revolutionize her understanding of wildlife behavior. The bears demonstrated not just tolerance of human presence but actual social interaction. They responded to Tom's voice, showed awareness of boundaries he'd set, and even demonstrated what appeared to be concern when he coughed from his morning allergies. Mr. Wheeler, she said finally, would you consider allowing me to document this relationship? This could change how we approach wildlife conservation and human-animal conflict resolution. Tom thought about it, watching as the Mama Bear taught her cubs how to safely eat the berries he planted especially for them. On one condition, he said, you have to understand and help others understand that this isn't about controlling or taming them, it's about respect. These bears are still wild animals, and that's exactly how they should stay. As autumn painted the mountains in amber and gold, the small town decided to honor their unique story with the first annual Angel Bear Festival. Tom initially resisted the idea, worried about drawing too much attention to his wild friends, but Margaret Chin convinced him it could Help spread an important message. Think about it, Tom, she said, arranging homemade bear-shaped cookies in her store window. People need to hear this story, not just about the rescue but about coexisting with wildlife, about choosing kindness first. The festival was scheduled for early October when the aspens would be at their brightest. Dr. Blackwood returned to give a presentation on her summer observations, bringing with her a team of wildlife conservation experts. The Anderson children, now junior, are themselves set up an educational booth about wilderness safety. What nobody expected was the mama bear's response to the celebration on the morning of the festival. As volunteers set up booths along the town's main street, Tom noticed familiar movements in the woods bordering the festival grounds. While I'll be, he murmured, watching as the mama bear and her cubs settled into a safe spot at the forest's edge, observing the activities with their usual intelligence. They stayed there all day, just watching, as if understanding they were somehow part of this human gathering. Emily Anderson spotted them first among the festival goers. Look, she whispered to her brother Jake, pointing discreetly. They came to their own party. The bears' presence transformed the festival from a simple town celebration into something magical. People spoke in hushed voices, moved more gently, and shared knowing smiles as they caught glimpses of the festival's honored guests watching from their woodland sanctuary. Dr. Blackwood used the opportunity to demonstrate proper wildlife observation techniques to fascinate a children. See how they choose to stay at a safe distance, she explained. That's wisdom we need to respect. The festival's highlight came when Tom finally agreed to share his story publicly. Setting up his chair on the small stage, he looked more comfortable with his audience after spotting the bears in their hiding spot. Folks often asked me what I was thinking that day when I decided to help a trapped bear, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Truth is, I wasn't thinking at all. I was feeling the kind of compassion my Sarah always taught me was the truest guide we have. As he spoke, describing not just the dramatic rescue of the Anderson children, but the daily small kindnesses exchanged between man and bear. Many in the audience wiped away tears. The mama bear, still watching from the forest's edge, let out a soft chuff that made Tom smile mid-sentence. You see, he continued, nodding toward the sound. We think we're so different from the wild creatures we share this land with, but in the ways that matter most, loving our families, helping those in need, remembering kindness, we're not so different at all. The festival raised enough money to support the new wildlife sanctuary for 2 years. More importantly, it sparked a movement in surrounding communities. Other towns began organizing their own conservation events, and schools started including lessons about wildlife cooperation in their curricula that evening. As the last festival goers departed and the cleanup crews began their work, Tom sat on a bench near the forest's edge. The mama bear approached closer than she had all day, her cubs following. Thank you for coming, he told her softly. You didn't have to, but you did, just like that night in the storm. You didn't have to help those children, but you did. You keep teaching us, don't you? The bear sat down in front of him, her cubs wrestling playfully nearby in the fading light. Their eyes met with the understanding that had grown between them over the months. She reached out one paw and gently touched the bench beside him, a gesture that spoke volumes about trust and friendship. Dr. Blackwood, who had been photographing from a distance, later wrote in her journal, today I witnessed something that challenged Alice. Everything we think we know about the barriers between species. Perhaps the real miracle isn't that a bear learned to trust a man, but that a man learned to listen when a bear had something to teach. As winter settled once again over the mountains, Tom noticed changes in his bear family. The cubs, now nearly grown, showed increasing independence, sometimes visiting without their mother. They were preparing for their eventual separation. A natural part of black bear life that Tom knew was coming, but still made his heart ache a little. One snowy morning, Dr. Blackwood arrived with exciting news. Her research paper about Tom's bears had been published in a prestigious scientific journal, and wildlife organizations worldwide were taking notice. But that's not even the best part, she said, warming her hands around a mug of Tom's coffee. We've documented similar behaviors in other areas. It seems your mama bear has been teaching other bears about human interaction. They're showing unprecedented levels of peaceful coexistence with nearby communities. Tom wasn't surprised. He'd seen how the mama bear communicated with other wildlife, how she seemed to spread an understanding through the forest. Sarah used to say that wisdom once learned needs to be shared, he reflected. As if summoned by their conversation, the mama bear appeared through the swirling snow, but today was different. She Approached Tom's porch with deliberate steps, carrying something in her mouth. It was a piece of fabric. Is that Dr. Blackwood started reaching for her camera. My old scarf, Tom whispered, recognizing the faded blue wool he'd lost it months ago while hiking back. When autumn was still painting the mountains gold, the bear placed it carefully on his porch steps, then sat back looking at him with those knowing eyes. She's been saving it, Dr. Blackwood breathed, amazed, waiting for the right moment to return it. Tom carefully picked up the scarf. It was clean, barely damaged, clearly protected somewhere until now. Thank you, he said softly to the bear, though I suspect this isn't just about returning a lost scarf. The bear's next actions proved him right. She turned to her cubs, now waiting at the forest's edge, and made a series of gentle sounds. They remained where they were, their first real act of independence. She's saying goodbye, isn't she? Tom asked, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Blackwood nodded, her scientific objectivity momentarily forgotten as she wiped away tears. The cubs are old enough now. She's preparing them and you for the separation. The mama bear stayed longer than usual that morning, sitting quietly with Tom as the snow fell around them. Dr. Blackwood documented everything, but even she fell silent, recognizing the profound nature of this moment. You know, Tom said, finally speaking to both the bear and Dr. Blackwood, Sarah always said goodbyes aren't really endings, they're just reminders to cherish what we've shared. The bear stood then, shaking snow from her fur. She approached Tom one last time, gently pressing her forehead against his hand, a gesture of trust and affection that Dr. Blackwood would later describe as unprecedented in documented human-wildlife interactions. Then, with one last look at the man who had changed her life as much as she had changed his, the mama bear returned to her cubs. Together they disappeared into the snowy forest, leaving only their tracks and an indelible mark on the hearts of those who witnessed their departure. Tom, Dr. Blackwood said softly, do you think they'll come back? He smiled, wrapping the return scarf around his neck. Maybe not in the same way, but they've left something here that will never leave, a lesson about trust, about kindness, about the connections possible between all living things. That's a gift that keeps giving. That evening, as Tom wrote in his journal, he added a special note, Sarah, my love, I finally understand what you meant about angels having many forms. Sometimes they come with wings, sometimes with fur, but they always come with lessons about love. Our bear may be moving on, but the trail they blazed between wilderness and civilization, between fear and understanding, will remain for others to follow. Spring returned to the mountains, bringing new life and unexpected developments, while the mama bear and her cubs had moved deeper into the wilderness as nature intended. Their impact continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Tom's cabin had become a sort of informal wildlife observation center. With Dr. Blackwood's guidance, he'd allowed the installation of non-invasive cameras in his yard, and the surrounding woods. School groups would visit, sitting quietly on his porch as he taught them about respecting wildlife and the importance of kindness. Mr. Wheeler, a young girl, asked one day, her hand raised high, do you miss your bear family? Tom smiled, adjusting Sarah's photo on the porch rail beside him. Every day, he answered honestly, but missing something doesn't mean you've lost it. Their story lives on, and how we've all changed. He was right, the changes were evident everywhere. The Anderson children had started a successful wildlife education program that was being adopted by schools across the state. Margaret Chenstore now had a special section dedicated to wildlife-friendly gardening and proper food storage in bear country. Even the old-timers who'd once viewed bears as nuisances had become advocates for conservation. One warm May morning, Tom heard excited whispers from a group of visitors on his porch. A young black bear had emerged from the woods, moving with familiar confidence through his yard. While it wasn't his mama bear, Tom recognized something in its behavior, the same careful respect for boundaries, the same gentle awareness of human presence. That's one of her students, he explained to the amazed visitors. They've passed down what they learned. Bears teach their young just like we do. Dr. Blackwood's research had confirmed that the remarkable behavior first observed in Tom's bear family had spread through the local bear population. Cubs that had never directly interacted with humans showed the same careful approach to human settlements, avoiding conflict and even seeming to pass on the knowledge to their own young. It's changing how we think about wildlife intelligence and cultural learning in animal communities, she explained during one of her regular visits. Your mama bear didn't just change her own family's behavior, she started a Generational shift. Tom's journal entries from this period reflected his deep appreciation for this continuing legacy. Each morning I watch new bears move through these woods with the wisdom their ancestors learned here. They remember the kindness, pass on the trust. Sarah would say that's how love works. It doesn't end with one act or one generation but keeps growing, keeps teaching. The Angel Bear Wildlife Sanctuary, funded by the festival and supported by ongoing community efforts, had become a model for wildlife conservation. Instead of focusing on separating bears and humans, it promoted understanding and coexistence. Rangers reported fewer conflicts between wildlife and humans than ever before. One evening, as Tom sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, he heard a familiar sound, a gentle chuffing from the forest edge. His heart leaped, but he knew better than to expect his old friend. Instead, he saw a young bear, likely one of her grandcubs, carrying a small branch of fresh berries. The bear placed the berries on his bottom step just as its grandmother had done so many times before, then sat back and watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold generations of wisdom. Tom smiled, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. "Thank you," he said softly, "for showing us that the story doesn't end, it just keeps being told in new ways." 10 years had passed since that first fateful encounter with the trapped bear. Tom, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, sat in his favorite rocking chair surrounded by photographs and memories. The most prominent photo showed the mama bear and her cubs from that first winter, alongside pictures of the Anderson children, now teenagers, receiving awards for their wildlife conservation work. Dr. Blackwood had recently published a comprehensive book about the Angel Bear legacy, as it had come to be known. The phenomenon of learned peaceful coexistence between bears and humans had spread across multiple states, changing wildlife management practices nationwide. "You were right all along, Sarah," Tom said softly to his wife's photo. "Love does find a way to keep growing." That morning, something extraordinary happened. As Tom sipped his coffee, he heard familiar sounds from the forest edge. There, emerging from the misty dawn, was an older female black bear. He recognized immediately his mama bear, returned after all these years. Her fur was graying around her muzzle, but her eyes held the same intelligence and trust. Behind her came two younger bears, clearly her newest cubs, and behind them Tom's heart nearly stopped were several other bear families, all moving with that same careful awareness that had become the hallmark of their learned behavior. "Well, look who's teaching the next generation," he whispered, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. The mama bear approached his porch, slower now with age but still dignified. She sat in her old spot, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a decade of stories. Her cubs watched from a respectful distance as other bears settled comfortably around the yard, creating a scene that would have seemed impossible 10 years ago. Drive Blackwood, who happened to be visiting that day, stood speechless with her camera. "Tom, she finally managed. This is unprecedented. She's brought her entire extended family, her legacy." "No," Tom corrected gently, "our legacy, all of ours, every person who chose kindness over fear, who helped spread the story, who taught others to see wildlife differently. This belongs to all of us." As if confirming his words, the mama bear made a soft sound, and one by one each bear in the yard placed something at the foot of his porch. Very small branches with fresh leaves, even a pine cone. It was a gesture that spoke of remembrance, of gratitude, of connection. Tom carefully made his way down the porch steps, moving slowly until he stood before his old friend. "Welcome home," he said softly. The mama bear gently pressed her graying forehead against his hand, just as she had done years ago, and that touch was a decade of shared wisdom, of boundaries bridged, of trust earned and kept. As the morning sun rose fully over the mountains, casting golden light across this remarkable gathering, Tom realized that this was more than just a reunion. It was a reminder that when we choose kindness, when we open our hearts to unexpected connections, we create ripples that continue long after we're gone. He added one final entry to his journal that evening: "Sarah, my love, today I witnessed the full circle of what you always taught me, that love, once given, never truly leaves us. It just grows in new ways, touches new lives, creates new stories. Our angel bear came back today, not just to visit but to show us that what we started here will continue generation after generation in the hearts of both bears and humans who choose to see each other not as strangers but as fellow travelers on this remarkable journey we call life."